back again. Round number 7, I believe we're on with Chalk Talk. Mm-hmm. This is Coximus here with Rob and Edward, looking at the Great White Rhino and the Thinking Powerlifter. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what we had mentioned last week. I was absent last week, but we touched on what is a program last week, and this week we're going to kind of get in depth a little bit more with internal and external loads, feelings during training, and then how they affect your training. Mm-hmm. So if you guys want to jump in on that, what do we got?
So this is going to start our series on like defining what is training as a skill, as this thing that we can meaningfully practice and improve upon, instead of training just being, I'm going to contact this coach, they're going to give me a program, I'm going to execute it, I'm going to add 50 pounds to my total, and it's just like that. We could think of it like the recipe that you see in a cookbook. Like if you have some total beginner execute a recipe versus a Michelin star chef executing the recipe, the outcome can be totally different. Same thing in training. You can have a total beginner look at a training program and read it and say, oh, this says 6 sets of 10, 60%. And their interpretation is, I'm going to just come into the gym, load up the bar to 60% and start doing it. And my body's really cold and my joints are creaking and my back is a little tight, but I'm just going to do it because that's what it says. And it's no fault on me. That's what is written for me. Those are my instructions. That's all I'm going to do. Versus someone who's trained for a while. They know that coming to the gym, I'm probably going to warm up, hop on the bike for a little bit, increase my body temperature, practice the movement pattern that I'm going to practice that day at lighter loads, and then gradually work up to 60%. And that understanding of how do we execute the training according to like my level of understanding of training, that is what we're going to delve into over the next couple episodes. And as Cox talked about, the first thing we're going to go over is it's like a little recap of what we talked about last week. What is a training program? We have a coach's interpretation of the training program. So, and in their head, they're like, I have this athlete in front of me. They understand the squat to this degree. And for them to improve upon it, I want them to do 6 sets of 10 at 60% this week. And then next week, 5 sets of 8 at 65%. The week after that, 6 sets of 6 at 70%. And I'm going to assume that their technique's going to hold up because from how I've seen them train so far, their technique is going to do pretty well. However, we can also have the athlete's interpretation of the training where like 6 sets of 10 at 60%, totally easy. 7 sets of 8 at 65%, that's pretty good. But for some reason, 70% for them is 315 pounds, and having 3 plates on the bar represents this like psychological barrier for them. And they have 315 on the bar, and then they have to tap into the Rocky soundtrack, and they get super aroused during training. And it's like
Taylor Swift,
or Taylor Swift, whatever floats your boat. and me, and like when they exceed that psychological barrier, it's like all technique goes out the window, all rational practicing of technique goes out the window, and they're just like they tap into their animal, their wolf and their lion and their shark, and like who knows what happens. They complete the program, but or even a shark or like a cheetah or
maybe shark.
They get really supple, but they're able to do the lifting, but there's no learning happening. There's nothing meaningful happening because every set is an RPE 10 because it's like they are overcoming this huge life barrier doing like 1 set of 6 at 315, then another set, and then another set, and they're like laying on the floor and they're super beat up, but they've overcome this gigantic mountain. And we don't want training to be like that. We want competition to be like that, but we want when we're training to meaningfully work on our weaknesses and meaningfully work on our technique. And the execution of a program varies from lifter to lifter. So say Rob does 6 sets of 10 at 60%, and then I do 6 sets of 10 at 60%. It's like our perception of what or how difficult 60% is can be different because we have the external load of this training session. So how much weight is on the bar, how much training volume we're doing, sets times reps times weight. It's like that's not going to change. 6 sets of 10 at 315 is going to be that is a hard number that volume represents. However, if you have Rob do 6 sets of 10 at 315, and then you have Cox do 6 sets of 10 at 315, one of them will perceive training to be harder than the other person does. And that is how we can differentiate external load from internal load. External load is weight on the bar, volume, these hard metrics. Internal load is how difficult we perceive training to be. And how difficult we perceive that to be varies from lifter to lifter according to like their training level, what their training background is, their fiber type makeup, etc., etc., etc. So Rob, would you like to go into a little of like how internal training load would vary from, say, powerlifter to weightlifter?
Oh, yeah, we can do that. So internal load is going to vary different. Me and Edward chatted about this a little bit earlier. From power lifter to weightlifter to rugby athlete to law enforcement to whatever it may be that you're training. So that's going to vary depending on the person and their background in the sports and other things. Being what we talked about earlier was like a powerlifter is used to like, I don't want to say slower, but like slower reps. Grindy is okay as long as, technique maintains and they're getting through it, whereas weightlifting is going to be a lot more explosive, a lot faster. So we take a weightlifter, just for example, and we put them under like a slow, grindy squat that they got to drive up or a deadlift that they got to kind of muscle through. And they're not used to that grind, that slow moving grind. So either they just let it go and abandon it. I would say most of the time they just let it go and think they can't get it. I've actually seen someone miss it, come back 30 seconds later and get it, just being like, hey, it's okay to go slow on these movements. And that's just because that's not what they're used to. They're used to fast, explosive movements. So that slowness is something they're not, well versed in at that time, I guess you could say.
They haven't had exposures to it, so it feels uncomfortable for them. They're not used to it.
Yeah, the last time they had a grindy rep was, 6 months ago or something like that. So that's just not what they're good at that moment. So it doesn't mean they're a bad lifter. It doesn't mean they can't perform, triples at 82%. It just means I would say like more like volume stuff, more like eights at like a lower percentage. It doesn't mean those last few reps they can't do. It just means they're not conditioned at it at that second.
And because it's like, say it's their first time ever doing eights, and because before that, when their coach would give them quote unquote volume, that would be like 3x3 or 3x5. It's like anything greater than singles and doubles is volume. And then they do eights, and then the first set of eights, like the worst thing in their life, and their heart is pounding out of their chest, and they're just panting on the floor. And that's an RPE 10 for them. Whereas they could do like 5 singles at 90%, they'd be totally fine. And it really depends on what the athlete is prepared for leading into that moment. That will dictate like how they rate their internal load.
Could we take that same Olympic athlete and just ramp them up to that, say 6s, then 8s, then 10s, and then they'd probably be really, really good at it?
Yeah, need to take time to kind of work the specificity of the muscles and what they're doing into each other. And another kind of category to touch on that internal load with different athletes, weightlifting, powerlifting. Also, there's going to be days where you work out early in the day or later in the day, or you've had a rough week outside of the gym, and your internal load may feel different than it did the week before, but you're lifting very similar weights and very similar rep schemes. And there's going to be weeks and days that things feel heavier, things feel lighter, and you need to kind of take the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows for what they are, and stick to your plan, obviously, but know that there's going to be hard times and easier times. And I believe also, and correct me if I'm wrong, not to bring in gender, but more of genetics, women to men, women seem to, with their fiber types, to have an easier time lifting a little bit higher intensities for more reps than men do.
Yes. And I guess we could delve a little bit into that. Women tend to have more type 1 fiber distribution, or type 1 fiber type distribution, less type 2 fiber, so they cannot produce as much force as quickly as males can in general, so they cannot incur as much damage to their muscles as males can. Therefore, they can do more work at higher intensities, and they can also do more volume. Whereas males, we can do more lower rep work, higher intensity, but that kind of burns us out because we generally have more type 2 fibers, more fast twitch fibers, and so like taking into account gender differences in lifting can help in informing us how an athlete can respond to, or like the athlete's internal load response to training.
So internal load response to training, if you take an athlete that's not experienced in what you're about to give them, like the high rep stuff we've been talking about, just overall, they're going to rate that session so much higher than someone who's been doing 8s and 10s for the last 3 weeks. It's going to be a lot less on the how tough was this workout session scale for that person.
And Rob and I were talking about this at the front desk earlier today, where It's like we have this tendency of categorizing athletes in this person's mentally weak, this athlete is mentally tough. And if we can consider the athletes like how tough an athlete is or how mentally weak an athlete is as like how prepared is the athlete for this thing, that is a much more productive conversation to have. If we take a total beginner like a weightlifter who's not used to doing sets of 8 and we give them sets of 8 and they're puking on the floor and we look down on them because like, oh, you're so mentally weak, what's wrong with you, you're so pathetic, versus like, oh, this person's not used to sets of 8, so maybe I can give them sets of 4 in week 1, sets of 6 the week after that, and then they ramp into sets of 8 finally, and when they get to 8s, it's like, oh, this doesn't feel that bad, versus it's like crushing them from the start. Because it's so easy to just crush an athlete from the start. Give any athlete 5 sets of 20 leg press, they're gonna feel terrible afterward. Any athlete, right? But it's like, that is easy. It's designing a program intelligently so that you can take an athlete from where they're at to where you want them to be to match their goals. And that takes a little more thought, a little more hard work, and not everyone is willing to do that.
And it kind of leads in, and we're not going to get into it, but another topic of, you know, the coach and athlete relationship. And this is kind of on the coach more. If you do have beginner athletes, you need to, you know, make sure that you're communicating, and, you know, the athlete is also coming to you with, you know, issues or problems they may have, and you need to kind of, every training cycle for every individual is going to be individualized and different. You need to make sure that you're staying up with the people that you're training so that they can perform to the best of their abilities and execute the program you're giving them with the greatest efficiency.
So takeaways on internal and external load being
external load is this more objective measure that we can use to track training. Internal load is how we can sort of take those objective measures and individualize those from lifter to lifter. And so long as we can like acknowledge that both metrics are valid in assessing the training of our athletes, that is how we can have the most comprehensive view of their training and how they're adapting to training. So it's not just us looking at here's some numbers on a paper and execute them because you're a robot, and also not entirely, you know, it's all touchy-feely how you think about and how your emotions react to this training. It's a little bit of both. And if we can acknowledge both and tap into both and get our athletes and ourselves to understand training from both perspectives, that is how we can have the most sustainable, most productive training.
perfect. I want to touch more on a lot of that stuff. We'll just save for the next one.
Yes.
But there's a lot more stuff we can touch on for sure.
And
that's going to wrap us up for today for the most part. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope this intrigued you to tune into next week's episode, because we got a lot more good information coming your way internally and externally as coaches, athletes, and owners. This is Chalk It Up Strength signing off. I'm Coximus. Next to me is Rob. Next to me is Edward. And we hope you all have a wonderful Monday.
see you next week.
See you next week.